Hello, Internet, and welcome to another Wednesday's serial. That looked dramatic. I don't care. I wasn't sure it was going to record. Anyways, I've been absolutely down in the dumps and thinking maybe if I talk comics, I'll feel better. So here we go. Cheaper than therapy. Um, I recently finished watching and finished reading something you probably heard of before, Preacher. And I have thoughts, so I just want to ramble about it. And the main thing is like, I'm going to assume everybody here has read Preacher. If you haven't, read Preacher. I, obviously. It's weird to even be saying that now. I haven't heard as much about people reading this lately, but I guess everybody. It feels like everybody read it back when, but maybe now there's a lot of lapse people. I don't know. It's weird because Preacher used to be the book that just sold and sold and sold, and so like everybody had read Preacher, even if they didn't read comics, they had read Preacher. It's one of those. And then in some ways, it got usurped by The Walking Dead, I feel like, in some ways. On the other hand, some of those people who had read Preacher were looking for maybe something new, some years later, and perfectly understandable. I understand the necessity to keep reading things. But Preacher is incredible. It feels almost timeless. There's some anachronistic things of the 90s. There's things that wouldn't fly today, but if you know anything about Preacher, it kind of is that and would play in that arena anyways. So if you have a trigger warning about anything, suicide, people dropping the N bomb, cursing in general, um, violence, weird sexual crap, Nazis, someone fucking a woman made of meat. It goes places. And it's interesting though, because this is definitely from Garth Ennis. If you don't know Garth Ennis, he likes to play with the debauchery, play with the effed up stuff. I mean, he's one of the I think he was the original principal creator of Cross, right? Maybe I'm wrong on that. He's definitely done Crossed along with a handful of other comic luminaries. But Preacher plays there, but at the end of the day, it has heart. And I think that's what makes it so compelling and what makes it so relatable in a lot of ways is there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of stuff in Preacher that just sucks. But when you come through the other end of this book, it's not like everything's happy go lucky. It's not like friendship saves the day. It's that friendship matters. It's that love matters. It's putting away some rationale for what feels right. It's a lot of things. Um, it's actually a really strong book. um, Jesse Custer, the main character, does a lot in this book that's really interesting and plays at an idea of what a typical hero is supposed to be. And what it gets to my I don't know, it's a quibble I have when people talk about this book. They say it's a western, right? And at its heart, right, it is. But to say Preacher's a western is weird. It has angels, it has devils, it has all the other stuff I just mentioned. It uses John Wayne and Clint Eastwood as a kind of moral compass in a way. It it sits in that area, but the Saint of Killers is the biggest Western element in here. Jesse comes from his fucked up family, which is more like Southern Bayou nonsense pain. And Preacher, as we move through, I mean, just to hold it up again, I mean, his messed up family, right? This whole book, playing with that, it's interesting to see how that works, how that plays through. And it's not just the Western Front, that's where it lives. We end at the Alamo, right? But we go to the Bayou, we go to the big city, the Big Apple, we go to all that. It's exploring America as a myth through some major landscapes and different parts of America that have different myths and feelings about them. I don't know, it's interesting, and I feel like it's a tell whenever someone says this line. The setting is one of the characters. That person is not a critic. That is not a person you should listen to. They are lying to you. They don't know what they're talking about. They're admitting that they don't know what words mean. That's a person you can ignore. um, but the use of setting in Preacher is really interesting because there's parts of Texas that are very different. There's the modern Texas in Salvation, and then there's the more like weird bayou stuff in Angelville, and it moves around, and it's weird to see how that all interplays. Um, but we also get a little bit of it through the ages, um, in different ways. So there's Spaceman, who kicks off this volume, who's someone who knew Jesse's dad in the Vietnam War, and we go to Vietnam for a bit, and it's there. And there's another chapter of Spaceman that's telling that, and we get a taste of Garth Ennis just wanting to tell war stories in his later days here. Some of it you see that in Preacher, or not Preacher, they're in Punisher too. Why they both have to be P? Um, and that's an interesting lineage. But I mean, having Steve Dillon do that is just incredible. And just to go off the tangent, but I need to say it because I don't talk enough about art. But I mean, reading Preacher again made me realize the brilliance of Steve Dillon. Because when I first read this, when I was in college, high school, college, I think I read a chapter or two in high school and didn't quite grok it, and people are talking about it. Read it in college. Just read it again. Much more to it. Steve Dillon, when I first saw him, and this is the first place I saw his art, thought it looked kind of weird. Wasn't quite what I liked, whatever. I've come a long way in appreciating comic book art since then. Looking at it again now, it's it's a particular comic book skill that Steve Dillon was the master of. And I haven't seen any modern artist try to quite hit what Steve Dillon has done. And I think so many artists should look at Steve Dillon because he does so much right, which is where so much of modern comic art kind of has been lost, I think. Steve Dillon uses simple shapes to build characters that display emotions, whatnot. He with the seemingly fewest lines possible can really delineate between a Cyclops, Arseface, Jesse Custer, Tulip, what a vampire looks like when Cass is vampiring out and not, and other people, and he can, you get a sense of people by the shape of them, by the shape of their eyebrows, everything, every emotion. If you look at a character that he draws when two different emotions are being displayed, you see all the same shapes and you see them just move just right or whatever it is. It's frankly kind of incredible. Um, I'm gonna hold this up. He doesn't do anything in this book. I'll get here in a second. Uh, so why'd I hold it up? Well, none of these covers are his work. They got what's his name? Glenn Fabry to do all the covers, and with a reason. They wanted this painted American like Western art thing, which is actually something else there. So I used to work for this place called Southwest Art. It was a magazine that just did a lot of art, usually like cowboy or like just Western themed stuff. There's some Native American stuff blended in. Um, the covers to this book and certain moments of this book called on a lot of those images that they went to. A lot of them are like calls on classic images from that area of art. It's actually really compelling and interesting to see how that connects just artistry. Like the landscapes in Preacher sometimes are just incredibly drawn. And, I live here and there's a few times where it's like, yeah, that's it. And I was talking about setting earlier. There's a lot of times comics like to go to a setting. And it can be hard because if you've vaguely been there, you're like, oh yeah, that's what it is. There's a lot of New Yorkers that will nitpick, like, oh, that building isn't next to that building or something. And it's like, yeah, we get it, but Spider-Man needed to swing. Fuck off. But like, I don't get to see it much. There's a few moments where things are in Colorado. A few Spider-Man comics I can think of. There was a Superman comic when JMS had him walking across America, and he stopped in at Boulder, and it's basically the only comic I can think of that tried to do Boulder. And of course, they go immediately to like an alternate universe or something. Really pissed me off. So it's like, I want to see Boulder in the background. It's literally the only reason I bought that issue. And it's like two panels, and they were on Pearl Street, which, if you've been to Boulder, makes sense. That's kind of where people would congregate. It's kind of where a crowd would be. Um, and it's a walking mall, so it worked for what they were doing. Sure enough. But it wasn't right at all. Like if you had ever walked down Pearl Street, it's like not only wasn't it right for what they were trying to do with the story, the way Pearl Street was laid out would actually help the story with what I was trying to do. Because there's kind of Pearl Street that kind of abruptly ends and becomes just kind of a weird strip mall down a street where the walking part ends, which played into this like end of trying to end his walk or whatever. And it could have worked better. But in Preacher, the landscapes, the places are right. And when they're in a bar or they're in a place like, you can feel the grime of the bad hotel room. You can feel the bad air in the bar. Like it works really well. And what Preacher does is it follows Jesse very well through the book, but it also takes time to build the characters. Part of the reason Hairstar is remembered isn't just all the up shit that happens to him. It's the fact that we spend time with him. It's not a few pages here and there ceded to the villain. It's sometimes his story was more important to build what was happening when Jesse interfaces with not just Hair, but the menagerie around him. And the pain that Jesse puts on them comes back towards the end. In this, we build TC, we build Jody, we mostly build the Saint of Killers with one of the strongest parts of Preacher held within. And it's not Steve Dillon, it's a number of other competent artists, and it's pulled in a way that allows you to appreciate the other artists because it's telling different stories with the same characters, but because these stories are out of sync with the main story, it works in a way where I've really developed that, like, as comic fans, we all have seen art switches and whatnot. Sometimes it's harder, sometimes it's easier. But I feel like no matter what, if you're on a good run with a decent artist on a comic and they change the artist, it doesn't matter if it's a good artist. Fuck. Great example. Um, the now fucking original Unlimited Spider-Man Bagley, 100 issues. Switched to Stuart Eminem. A lot of people weren't on board. Stuart Eminem. And the thing is I get it. I was with them going back to it, like, it's fucking Stuart Eminem. Who has a problem with this? But it's not that. It's that we had a story with a set art and we want that to continue because that's part of the story. When that changes, it's just off. This worked in a way, and bringing Dylan in, and also, admittedly, this is what I call brass ring run. Um, Giving Dylan a little time to catch up. Kudos to them. It was just a win all around. Where are we? Yeah, speaking of places and different things and different feelings, this plays with some different religion and whatnot. And here are big three, right? So as we go through and as we build these places and as we build these characters, and it's focused on America and has all this focus and intentionality, and as we move through the characters, as we go through War in the Sun, is where a lot of it comes to a head in reality. Um, there's a lot of pain in this quest. What happens to Hair Star is comedic effect and all that, but he plays into a larger theme where the shenanigans that put Preacher on the map came home to roost in the fact that Jesse loses an eye. What happens to Tulip? What happens to Cassidy? What happens to um, Hare's minions and whatnot? The pain of this quest takes a toll on people. Hare's a monster, but is Jesse not also a monster? Is his loss of his eye and other, damage that happens to him, Tulip, the back of Tulip's head, to her, are those not losses of humanity as well? Does that make them more of a monster? You have to think about that. And there are the good guys and the bad guys, but it's not in the normal superhero comic booky vein that we normally get. That's the best thing about Preacher coming out of that. And was maybe the lesson Preacher could have left us with, that at this point the industry's forgotten. There's no fucking nerd shit in the whole thing. None. And that's the most important thing about Preacher. It's, if you break it down, one of the greatest American stories ever told, the great American novel written by an Irishman. Great. But there's no nerd shit. There's some ability, there's some genre in here, but it's so many genres, and so many of them are so integral to America. And what's really weird about Cass as a vampire, which is arguably the closest to it, is that he's a vampire in that he sucks blood from people, sure, but you don't see him flying around. You don't see him pulling a lot. He's strong as hell, but he also preys on people, not in a hoo back alley maniacal kind of villain way, in a way where you get to know him, you get to like him, and then he starts taken, and then lives get ruined, and it's saying something else. It's it actually goes somewhere, and it's really something. And what's amazing is Cass's considered one of the main crew. There's several chapters in this book where he's gone. Like if you're reading this month to month, yeah, Cassie's a side character, uh, seemingly, but he's one of the main ones in some way. And it's just interesting how this book is able to let that kind of thing go and then pick it back up, which is another strength in this book. It's telling different stories, it's exploring different things, it comes back, there's an intentionality, and it builds to a meaningful ending. Endings matter, and we get there. But in Salvation, what we learn, what is built, is really interesting because this almost has nothing to do with the rest of the series in this book. I, almost nothing. But it ends up being a huge turning point for the book that gets us to the end. Um, I don't know. It's interesting in that way. So I should start putting some meat on it now that I'm rambling for damn near a half hour. So if you look at the characters, Jesse has a lot of intentionality. He's going to become a cowboy and whatnot. If you look at him in the TV show, they want to make him more of an action hero than someone with grit. I guess it just doesn't compare. And a lot of it is the build towards the end that doesn't work. If you look at Cassidy in the book versus the show, A, he's far more present, and B, they have this whole arc with vampires that's really. I'm reading this in trade. I don't know if it's one or two issues, but it's one quick story relatively that's played so differently. In the show, they have him deal with this vampire that has all these vampiric powers. You find out that that vampire is able to do that because he's feeding off of other people he just sired and then kills them to drink vampire blood, basically. Cassidy gets one, puts an end to it, and whatnot. Makes Cassidy a hero in this weird little niche. Whereas in this book, there's people who want to be vampires and whatnot, but it's not really. They're basically goths, right? In that story. And in through the entire book of Preacher, we see two vampires, Cassidy, and for a moment you see the one that got him, that turned him. When you go through go through his story, that's pretty much it. Technically, you could argue a couple of characters may or may not have been. It's really interesting because it makes it this myth, and it makes, I don't know, it puts a lot on Cassidy as that metaphor that I got to before. In the show, he's just kind of a guy along for the ride. He has a few moments of weakness, but it's something different. And fuck, in the book, what he does to Tulip after Jesse, they think, dies, keeping her on drugs and locked in these various like dingy hotel rooms, and it's just bleak. Um, because you wander the way, you find out he's one of this other string of women with the lives he wrecked along the way. In the show, they loved each other, but she loved Jesse more, and he has to like live with that, and it's this hokey piece of shit. I don't know. Um, it's weak. It's a lot weaker. And then Tulip in the book is interesting because she's a girl from some unfortunate circumstances, some of them a little uh, storybook in a way, but she ends up being a hit woman and good with a gun, like really good with a gun. Like there's a few scenes where it's like, damn, that's basically the Punisher. Uh, but it's it's played as her being somewhat exceptional with one skill. In the show, she's just an action hero. You lose the fidelity because it goes too far. She becomes too much larger than life all the time, and she doesn't have the vulnerability here. Though in some ways she might be the character that comes out of the show the strongest. There is the race swap with her, but I don't know. In throughout the book, she's very much the girlfriend and the girl, and I don't know. In the show, they don't quite do that. They let her be BA. So I don't know about that. Hair Star in the book is just a villain. They play a few different things, but they play it a lot more for comedic relief and goofs and whatnot. But through Hair Star and the Grail in the show, so many things change. The Grail in the book is a secret organization as we get hints of how it operates and how and how much this weighed on them when 20 or so of them got killed, or maybe more, but like a sensible number. In the show, it's just a never-ending horde of goons. It's weird that the comic book that could do whatever put more material thought and weight to the organization than the show that literally had to show different bodies and do that. um, Hare's minions are goofy in both aspects, but I don't know. I I think the comic makes them land a bit more. The show, again, just hijinks and goofs. Um, yeah, and then the one of the biggest losses is the Saint of Killers is, oh man, this guy is a presence in the comic. They change his story completely in the show, and it ruins the ethos of the entire story in some ways because they allude to it in the show where Jesse sees John Wayne, and that's kind of the angel on his shoulder. The Saint is supposed to be Clint Eastwood, and he's supposed to be hate personified, basically, through the story of the most brutal Western ever. And okay, so in the book, he's he's a hard riding like hitman on the West, doing whatever jobs, scalping Indians to get the pay, whatever it is, just son of a bitch, real bastard. Obviously, it's Garth Ennis, but he learns to love when a woman takes a chance on him and they have a family. And then we find out later God arranges to have them all killed. And at this point, he closes up completely. He feels nothing but hate. And so he's shot and killed when he goes to check on them, too. Then he gets to hell, and they're trying to punish him and do everything for all of his sins. And everywhere around him starts freezing because his hate freezes hell. And the devil's trying to beat it out of him. And that's how they kind of deal with that kind of thing. And apparently, like, he won't stop hating. He can't stop hating. And the devil gets desperate and whatnot. And the saint plugs him eventually. And then he's led up to go be the saint of killers, and he's this myth of the hate. And it's interesting there because what Garth Ennis is doing with that is creating a devil to Jesse's angel, but he's also pulling through the Western theme. But he's also creating a myth and putting it in. And this book has several themes, one of them being myths, and that becomes the heaviest laid in Alamo. The opening of this trade talks about the myth of the Alamo. Look too closely and it falls apart. And he starts talking about the details of the men there, Davy Crockett and um, Custard, and like, who were these men? Were they slavers? Were they real bastards? No. They're men who held the ground, and from their moment, from their myth, the heart of Texas was born. It, and it's kind of this interesting way that's explored throughout the book in a number of different ways. Does voodoo work? Well, it might be new agey and whatnot, but it does play to a number of other, like psychotherapy things that people do to help themselves, just with a bit more pomp and circumstance. Do drugs do certain things? Well, there's the myth and there's the reality, and what does it play? There's these stories that we tell, and the characters are compelling, but if you think about it like a news story, it changes. We have our heroes. We have our heroes in Preacher. Absolutely the good guys and the bad guys. But if you look at the good guys too closely, how good are they? They're not following the law. You know, it's it's really interesting. It's really smart in that way, and it does a lot of this without actually saying it. But the themes are there. None of that's in the show. Not a lick of it. So when we get to the Alamo, and that's the other thing. The show's ending is after all the search and all the pain and a lot of weird moments that feel out of place that worked in the comic because they were getting at something. In the show they just kind of lift or twist or merge. um we get Jesse and God having this weird one-on-one where Jesse's almost looking for God's love, and then beats him up and goes on his way. And what's it matter? The book ends with Jesse having a plan for God, and then he gets into a fight with Cass. And previously, Cass made a deal with God. You find out what it is, and Cass says, like, ain't no way Jesse's gonna be able to do anything at God, right? So I'm gonna offer what he can offer, basically. And all I want is for him to live through it, and then I want to live through it. Cassidy doesn't, per se, and then Jesse gets resurrected. And then you find out Cassidy's resurrected too because God is a loving God. But it's this whole thing that Jesse figures out. Everything God's done is because he needs love. It's a parallel off of Cass. He's kind of a leech. Free will's only there because you have to choose it, but he needs you to choose it. So he'll engineer everything so that you do choose it. And then he does all these fucked up things. Hmm. But Jesse's plan went a bit deeper. So the Saint of Killers is waiting, takes him out. It's more of a thinker, and it's less satisfying because after everything, after the entire journey of Preacher, Jesse doesn't even get to God, really. But did he need to? It keeps the abstract with the abstract and keeps the material with the material. And I don't know, it's strong. The show just goes for a cheap ending and walks away, and you wonder what it's all for. I don't know. The other thing about the show is it is the weirdest damn adaptation I've ever seen. Plot lines from damn near the end of the book, like with Salvation, get mixed into the very beginning. Um, Parts with Cass are flown throughout the books and elaborated on and changed completely, like I said earlier, mostly to give him stuff to do where he otherwise wouldn't have. Uh, Tulip stuff has changed. The way her family functions becomes a lot more uh, dramatic gunman than a story about a girl whose dad wanted a boy and dealing with some of that. And like I said, Tulip might be stronger in the show, but Tulip's solo story, the two issues that we get kind of explaining her backstory, infinitely more compelling. Also, more compelling in this book is Amy, who is Tulip's friend, who plays a small role throughout and creates some bandwidth on the world. I don't know. Sitting here reading through it again remind me how damn great Preacher is. Again, none of the nerd shit, just a damn good story. It's had me thinking a lot about the comics I'm getting and what I'm liking and what I'm going through. Don't get me wrong, I love my nerd shit, but damn, we need another book that can build to something like this and that eventually ends after the as long as the series can go, it then finishes and doesn't try to go past, but also isn't just a 6 issue whatever, or just a laugh, just a one off. Something that has entertainment and substance. A goddamn story. We need more of it, and it made me think because if I look over, I have my oversized Sandman collection. And if you look at the labels, you see it go from Vertigo to DC Black Label. When we lost Vertigo, we didn't lose an imprint of a million. We lost something in comics that had produced a high percentage of the greatest comics ever created this side of the pond, especially for American comics, the amount of them that you would recommend to people, most of them are probably Vertigo books. Not saying there's not others, not saying that other things can happen. I know a lot of that supposedly moved to Image or whatnot, but it's not the fucking. I can't think of that many Image books I'd recommend to people, honestly. There's a few, don't get me wrong, but there's not that many. I honestly wouldn't recommend Invincible to a lot of people because if people wanted superhero comics, there's a lot of stuff I'd recommend before Invincible. But if people were curious in reading some comics, but ones that aren't superhero stuff, and it's hard for your mind to not jump to Preacher, Transmet, maybe Sandman, Why the Last Man, like fuck, 100 Bullets maybe, like oh man, who who else has done a Preacher? And I know that's a high bar, but also what's reaching for this anymore? Really, what's reaching for Preacher? I know there's other stuff out there. I know there's some honest to God westerns. I know there's some crime comics. I know there's some things continuing. But goddamn, I have not seen anything quite reaching for Preacher. And I think we need it. I don't know. If you guys have any thoughts about Preacher, please drop them here. Cheers.